Most of these students who went through the School of Physiotherapy were given a health department bursary, and the bursary would bond you for 2 years if you had it for 2 years of your program. I didn't take a bursary in first year. I was a Dunedin student and I didn't know that I wanted to be bonded by a ministry who would tell me, or a department it was in those days, who would tell me where I was going to work. But in year 2 I did take a bursary, so I was bonded for 1 year. So for my year as a bonded new graduate, I was placed in Oamaru at the Oamaru Hospital, and it really was a great year. The hospital in those days was placed at the top of the hill, right above Oamaru, so it had a commanding view all over the sea and the town, and there was a very big nurses' home at the back, and so I lived in the nurses' home and was put on the same floor as the sisters who'd lived there forever. But it was warm and quite comfortable, and the meals were great. And around the hospital they had gardens, so they actually grew their own vegetables for the patients and for the staff. So we always had fantastic food and very fresh veggies from the gardens around. Because it was a small hospital, I got to have a huge variety in terms of experience in physiotherapy. I used to do antenatal classes for women and postnatal classes. There was a nursing school there in those days, and we used to give exercises to the nurses and give them training programs. We used to make them run down the hill and run up again as part of their fitness program. The hospital medical manager had just left at the beginning of the year that I started, and he had gone to take on the first position as a manager of the ACC, which had just commenced at that time. And unfortunately, Dr. Hentis came back to us as a patient after a very short time in that job because he had had a stroke. And so, having been the chief medical superintendent for the hospital for so many years, and then having 6 months on a new job and coming back to be a patient was hard for his family, but it was an interesting experience to be involved with managing him. We also, I recall in the year that I was there, it was the first time that they ever kept their coronary care patients in a little coronary care unit, and they had just bought an ECG machine. And so again, it was the change of the more local hospital having the ability to actually manage patients in acute care settings. And one of the other things that happened in the year that I was there is that the physiotherapy department got a hydrotherapy pool, and it was just being completed and filled shortly after I started. We filled it up with water to the top, and we went in, and it was brown and bubbly. Obviously there were things growing in the water, so it had to be drained and they had to put filters on the water, and I would often manage to treat my patients without going into the Hubbard tanks, so I think that was very wise that we'd put the patients in, but it always seemed to be a sort of yellowy brown colour, so we'd often just treat them from the side. And then one of the other things which was great about that environment was that a very well-known orthopaedic surgeon from Dunedin, Bruce McMillan, would drive to Oamaru once a month to do a clinic, and the clinic was always held in the physiotherapy department, and so the patients would come in for consultation in the physiotherapy department, and the physiotherapist was able to sit in on the clinic and often would be able to advise them. He was very good about teaching us, and he'd been one of the lecturers for us at the school anyway, but he also would, besides teaching us, would actually ask us for our opinion. And it was very much a tradition that he would have a meal brought down from the kitchens before he left, and you would always have to sit with him and have a discussion whilst he was eating his dinner before he left to go back to Dunedin. So it was quite a privilege to work with him, and often to be the physiotherapist who would be in there in the clinic with him. And then of course we would continue to manage a number of the patients during their rehabilitation. And the senior physiotherapist who was there at the time was a much older woman who was working part-time and had come back into the profession, and perhaps wasn't so confident about working in the clinic and doing some of those things. So often it was my job to help him in the clinic and to sit with him and have conversation whilst he had his dinner. He always wore a little rosebud. He had a wonderful rose garden, he and his wife, in Dunedin, and so he'd always have a rosebud in his lapel when he was in the hospital, whether it was Dunedin or coming up to Oamaru. So quite a fantastic character really, and again a privilege to be able to work alongside him. So besides looking after the antenatal and postnatal care. We had medical patients, paediatric patients, surgical patients. They did some very modest surgery in the hospital. So it was an excellent environment to get a grounding in everything. We had outpatients, you had patients with psoriasis right through to elderly patients who'd had strokes. And so the experience I gained over a year of living there was great. And it was also a good social environment. There were a lot of other young people who were also sent to Oamaru, so it was quite good in the evenings to be able to play squash or do other things. And the ski fields were also quite close, so you could go and learn to ski, even though we had wooden skis with horrible leather boots on them, but we still managed to learn to ski with all those old-fashioned things. And the Land Rover that took us up to Oha, which was the closest ski field, the hairpin bends were so tight the Land Rover had to back round the corner to get up. And there was also another physiotherapist who worked very part-time, who was on a property that was involved in the hydro development, so part of their land was flooded and they had to build their new wool shed further up the hill. And so as new grads we got to go and help them for their wool shed opening party. So it was a very social situation and good environment to work in, and I would recommend having a rural contact to any new grad, or at least working in a smaller hospital, because you get a huge variety.